Now I'd like to invite Robert Leckie, Director of Spike Island, and Simon Sheikh, Program Director of the MFA in Curating at Goldsmiths, and also the Brunswick Club. And speaking on behalf of the Brunswick Club today is Alistair Cameron and Lizzie Hoare. So I'd like you to all join us. Thank you.
This is mine. I'm over.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paula, and also thanks to Nella for organising everything. So to kick off, I'd just like to say that when I moved to Bristol, which was a year ago, everybody kept telling me how brilliant the Brunswick Club was, from artists to other organisations, NPOs, the Arts Council. Yet it's also struggled. So I think it's interesting to talk about the kind of history of the Brunswick Club and the challenges that you've faced up to now, to kick off.
The actual Brunswick Club, I think, was formed in about something like 1899. It was actually a working man's club, which is it was kind of like big Georgian building in Brunswick Square, which is in St Paul's in Bristol. And that was a kind of old-fashioned working man's club. It had like a couple of bars and some kind of a ballroom. It had like a big basement space with skittle alleys in it, and they had a bunch of kind of upstairs rooms. I'm from a collective. We were in Bristol, and we were set up in 2015 called BEEF, which stands for the Bristol Experimental and Expanded Film. And we were renting a few different buildings around Bristol for a while. And we were moved out of the building we had in the adjacent square, Portland Square. And around that time, we went into residence in a few places. This is going to be a really long story, but I'll just try and keep it brief. But so we moved out, and then our landlord said, "Oh, I can show you this building, which I've the guy who was renting us our previous space. I can show you this building, which I've bought from the Brunswick Club, which went bust. They went into bankruptcy, and it's really big, but you might be interested." So we went and had a look, and we just thought it was an amazing building. It had loads of character. It still had like all the pictures of guide dogs on the wall. It still had their notice board with it. It was a bit sad actually, because all the trophy cabinet was still there. Loads and loads of these kind of things that they just seem to have left. The pool table upstairs, the Skittles, all of these things. The Skittles trophies, they were all there. And we looked at them. We immediately thought this would be an amazing place to take over. He was offering it to us for 9 months. So we approached Champ, which Lizzie's one of the members of Champ, which is another collective, and another collective called Residents, which is a kind of long-standing group of performance artists. And we basically agreed that we would move into this building together, so bring these 3 collectives together into a building and run it collectively as a space where we could make work and hopefully collaborate, and then also running a kind of public program of events, sound gigs, performances, exhibitions, and a lot of workshops as well. And then we invited another group called Bermuda Triangle Test Transmissions, who were based in London and running a show on Resonance FM, to come and be kind of artists in residence. And they kind of became part of this kind of collective of collectives. And essentially, we agreed that we would divide it up on square footage, and we would all pay an equal share of, individual studios would be rented on that square footage basis, and then we'd also divide all of the public event spaces, the kind of test spaces, into evenly among everyone, each collective. And we rented the place for 9 months, and you should say something soon, Lizzie. But after 9 months, our landlords tried to evict us because, he put in a planning application because his whole intention was to have us there to avoid having to pay for security, essentially, and stop squatters coming in. He put in a public planning application to turn it into flats. And at that time, we'd been running quite a large-scale program, a lot of events, and we'd sort of almost become a kind of like clubhouse for Bristol artists and people who are interested in kind of underground culture in Bristol. And that community, there was a massive number of kind of objections to the planning, which was, I think it was 300 or 400, which were actually really amazing to read. And so we were going to move out, but having read all that, we decided we were going to stay. And the planning got rejected, and we ended up staying for another year and a half. So we were there until March in 2019, when after 2 more planning applications by our landlord, it finally went to a kind of national inspectorate, and unfortunately we were then it wasn't between us and the landlord, but it was between the council and the landlord. But they decided that the heritage upkeep of the building was overriding our arguments that it was a community asset. So we moved out.
I guess just to stay on the planning thing. So when he did his first sort of planning application that goes to the public and people can object or not, as Al said, I think we were told that usually the council expects about 2 or 3 people to respond or care at all, and we had like nearly we had 300, which we didn't expect at all. I don't think anyone did really, and it was from people who had visited the club once, or just knew of its stature in the cultural underground scene, I guess, in Bristol, and we kind of felt a sense of responsibility after that, and really hadn't expected it. So we'd kind of gone in the space thinking we were going to do this thing and it was going to be great, but we didn't realise that it would meet the need as much as it did, and that we would have as much support from the underground, but also from people like Bristol City Council and other institutions and stuff. And that kind of was a bit of a game changer, really. We were like, okay, we really need to fight for this. And because we play by the rule that we're artists, and that's what we're here to do. And we don't want to take on the battles of, these political battles necessarily, but it is all very, you can't escape it, really. It's really relevant. So, yeah, we kind of ended up doing that.
Yeah, I suppose it was interesting. Earlier on, there was talking about the kind of the personal is political, and for us it was something like the opposite of that. It was like the impersonal is political, and we were thinking a lot about, I guess, the politics of a community, and then that shifted into being a question of how we became involved in the kind of political questions in Bristol, and for artists in Bristol, which is how do you find a space to work in? We were lucky because we didn't even have any heating, so the rent of the building was really cheap, and that meant that we could offer studio space for a similar kind of rate that Spike Island would offer, which is heavily subsidised. So we were able to offer basically space which allowed a whole different mix of artists, and it was a really intergenerational mix, kind of people in their 20s up to their 60s. But we could offer them space to actually make work. But one of the most gratifying things for me was certainly that even though we didn't really have a strategy, it was just coming together as a kind of a way of doing it. But there was so much collaboration between the groups, between the individuals and between the artists, and I think then also with all of the other, I guess underground music promoters, performers, and all these kinds of people, and even we hosted events with AN and Bristol University. But it feels like it generated a whole bunch of new projects and new groups, and it's still doing that now, even though we've moved for now into a kind of smaller studio while we try to find a new building.
Can I jump in and just say that I think in many ways it seems like, from what you're saying and from the discussions we've had before, that it's kind of precarity that runs through the project. And you also said when we spoke earlier that there's nothing wrong with being temporary and under threat. But in fact, it almost seems to me that it's things like future-proofing or the implied need to develop, which can undermine the kind of independence or radicalism or spirit of these kinds of organizations. And so how have you sought to kind of deal with that conundrum? Because presumably you're also in a position where you need to make ends meet, and you want the project to continue to an extent, but at what cost?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing that we didn't, I know we're talking too much, but the only thing we didn't say was that we wanted to keep that building. We were desperate to maintain it, and we knew we were there for a short time, but because so many people wanted that building to exist, and wanted to do things there, we did try really hard to actually find a way to buy that building, which felt a bit unrealistic. It was like £1.5 million. But through that, we got in touch with a lot of the organisations in Bristol, like Spike Island, the Arts Council, obviously, Bristol City Council, and even Watershed and Arnolfini, and all of these people were really supportive to us, and everyone wrote letters that we could use. We had testimonies from loads and loads of different arts organisations, so it felt like a lot of people were behind us. We had to try and buy that building, but we couldn't do it. We had a long battle with our landlord about all of these things, and we just couldn't quite do it. So we wanted to maintain like a permanent space for sure. But I guess we have to think about now how we go ahead as a collective rather than as a building, which is what we kind of were both. The other thing to say is that through that, I think the Arts Council were very supportive, and we got some development money. We were able to employ some consultants, including Paula, actually. And we did a lot of work to try and really raise the awareness of what we were doing there in order to try and secure that building long term. And when that fell through, just to work on how we could maintain the ethos and the kind of collective of collectives idea that we had, which did seem, and still does seem, really important in Bristol, because the first presentation, talking about all those challenges, in some ways coming together and pooling our resources in this way was a way of overcoming a lot of those issues. And of course we're really grateful for funding, and we would absolutely seek it, but we were almost running a self-sustaining model because we were able to run loads of events and take the bar, put that back into what we were doing, and so on. So, I mean, I think when we were talking earlier, we were talking about like, how do are we trying to develop into an organisation, or are we happy to remain as a kind of collective of artists making art? And I think it's the latter. But the challenge is how do you do that, but also sustain yourselves, or how do you have resilience? These kind of buzzwords that are being used.
I think maybe that's a good point to bring in Simon, actually, because Simon, in your role at Goldsmiths as reader and program director of the MFA Curating, you're also educating the next generation of curators. And if I read the program introduction to today, it talks about many challenges, let's say, so climate emergency, the aggregation of wealth, post-truth politics. So it seems very hard to be optimistic these days. But how do you teach these curators to at least be resilient and also act with care in the cultural field?
That's difficult to answer very briefly. Maybe I'll like to start at another angle and maybe get back to it, which is just following up on what you talked about, and also the fact that we are in an institutional network here. So it's interesting to think about institutional models, and particularly what alternative culture brings to those models and how they challenge those models. So I just got back from working in Norway on a triennial in Bergen. I'm not going to talk about the project itself, but one of the venues we worked with is artist-run space called Bergen Kjøtt, which means Bergen meat. It's a former sausage canning factory that was derelict, empty, was squatted, transformed into a concert place, exhibition space, and artist studios. And of course, they've now become partly legalized, so it's a semi-legalized squat. At the same time, the city council, in its effort to legalize it, decided that they should take over the building from the hostile landlord, which they did. And of course, now it's the end of the artist-run space, because the city wants them to have renovated the studios according to health and safety rules. They want the prices of the studios to be fair, so they have to follow the market prices of the city, which the artists who there now can't pay. And they want the art space to have proper programming and run probably by someone graduated from my program or something like that, right? So this is now the end. So the moment when the institution gets help from politics is when it dies. Yeah, so I think that's what we really have to ask ourselves. Can we not always ask artists or self-organized spaces and groups to institutionalize? How can we ask ourselves to deinstitutionalize at the same time? So that's kind of what I think, and that somehow has to do with the teaching. Now, at the same time, and that's maybe to be hopeful, so this is one of the last projects that those two main people who run it, are going to be involved in, and I talked to them now when I was there and said, so what are you going to do? They said, well, we decided it's just not worth our while. We've run it in our own way for so long, why would we just can't do it? So we're just looking for another place. So we're just going to do something else. It's going to be smaller, it's going to be another part of the city, but we're going to do something else. It's not about the space. It's about the activity. When the very famous punk club, CBGB's on the Lower East Side in New York City was closed, that last week they had a residency for Patti Smith, who was one of the first people to make the place famous. She hadn't played there in like 40 years, played 5 nights, and the last one was on New Year's Eve. There's a recording of it. It's quite beautiful, the people crying and saying, this place is so fantastic. And Patti Smith says to the audience, forget about the place. The spirit that was here will never die. It'll just go somewhere else. It's not the space. So in terms of site specificity, I really like and this all has to do with resilience, the model that was proposed by the Isola Art Center in Milan, which was a factory, also squatted, had artist studios, and ran a program in an area that was then becoming gentrified, and they were thinking about how could they knew, of course, the intrinsic relationship between artist studios and gentrification, and thinking how can we contribute to the movement of anti-gentrification in Milan. And they came up with this notion of saying we should not think about site specificity, but fight specificity, which means which are the fights and the social movements that we're engaged in. That means that we think beyond what our spaces can do, that because they're temporal, but how do we sustain our practice, our alignments with struggle? And that struggle, being aligned with that, say, like the protest today, will give a lot of strength to your projects and vice versa, and hopefully build communities, constituencies, etc. Right? So that's one aspect of site specificity. The other one is, of course, to then look at the institutions we have and try to deinstitutionalize them, or at least make them into spaces of conflicts by saying they're also fight specific. So someone earlier today said they should be neutral vessels. I think that's absolutely impossible. They can't be. So we should acknowledge the conflicts involved in a place like Arnolfini or whatever, and bring them to the fore. We don't have to agree on them. They are intimidating, as some people said, by their very architecture. And they will probably remain so, but we can make them less intimidating if we allow them to be spaces for conflicts, and if we bring the struggles and the fights into those places, and not say they should be outside. So it was actually quite good with the sound piece before, where we had the street coming in here.
Thank you. My next question maybe does and maybe doesn't relate to that. I was going to talk about a text that you wrote in 2016 called The Art After Trump. It was published by Eflux. And in that you talk about this idea of the rise of the extreme centre as epitomized in the US political landscape by someone like Hillary Clinton. But you also talk about a kind of trust or faith in the artistic imagination, and perhaps having less faith in the operations of institutions, galleries, museums, art fairs, biennials, and so on. So I guess the question was, to what extent do you think that these kinds of institutions have already been occupied by the extreme centre, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think they have been more or less totally occupied by the extreme centre. So this is a term from Tariq Ali. He wrote a book called The Extreme Centre, which was it's mainly a criticism of New Labour, but also this idea that there is no alternative to neoliberal reform. That kind of language, that we all also have to talk in that language. We've done that today as well. I think we need to change the currency. Maybe talk about difference rather than just diversity, so on. Bringing back some of the social conflicts inherent in this. But of course, the institutions, in a let's say in a modern framework, art institutions have, to a large extent, been the expression of that idea of a certain model of democracy and a certain model of accessibility and community. That's quite centrist and quite neoliberal, and they have had very little choice in becoming that. So I'm not blaming the institutions for that per se. My point is just that model is now as historical as was the former national narrative bourgeois model of what a museum was from the 19th century. So this centrist model, the neoliberal model, lack of a better term, is as historical now. It's as broken as the 19th century model of a national citizenry. So this is a challenge that I think we all share. And when, regardless of where we stand in this kind of fight specificity question, all institutions face that. What is going to be the role? And that has to do with structural changes that we don't control necessarily as cultural producers, which are in the way that the relationship between culture and politics is changing. And in this comment that I wrote about the election of Trump was just that he's not the only example. You can see a lot of other examples also in Europe. In Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban has argued for what he calls an illiberal democracy. I think that's something that resonates very deeply with the Prime Minister of this country at the moment. But the idea is that it should still be democracy, but it shouldn't be liberal. It should be illiberal. It should be ethnically cleansed. It should be nationalist, and it should be anti-modern. And one of the first things that Orban's party did, and despite protestations, very weak ones from Europe, was to simply sack all the museum directors, regardless of whether they were considered to be liberal, radical, conservative. But they were all of them, because art is a liberal arts field. So it's, as a field, this is the enemy. So they were all fired in one go and replaced by a nationalist from the party. Yeah, and this was from institutions like the Ludwig Museum, which is kind of the equivalent of Tate in Hungary, to the smaller artist-run spaces, all of it. Yeah, so one of the things that came out of that, which was not necessarily successful but was interesting, was this thing called the Off-Biennial that was organized by artist-run spaces and commercial galleries, so all the non-state forms of art production in a political response to the state. So that's an interesting alliance that you would have between commercial galleries and artist-run spaces. So one has to think always of the new openings that come into those things, and they're of course very context-specific. It's not the situation that we face here. It's probably the case also in Poland, certain other places, but it's not the case here, of course. But I think that it's very hard to envision in the near future a huge influx from investment from the Arts Council, and it's certainly not one that isn't based on this private-public collaborations and match funding. So, and with that decreasing, there has to be a moment where one starts to think about: is it really sustainable to keep working in that model? Can we try to think of deinstitutionalizing in other ways, rather than constantly chasing the same funds like everybody else? We know there's less, and then it's about, well, we have to become better at writing applications. we can become as good as we want. There's only going to be less people being successful every year. Yeah, so that's the reality. So could we maybe start not being in that game anymore, rather than chasing it until the moment of closure, as for example the Plymouth Arts Centre, which is a very sad story in this region. So and that's happening everywhere, and then all of them getting poorer, competing for the same smaller and smaller amount of money. Maybe some of the institutions could say, let's deinstitutionalize, let's give over half of Anarfini to the Brunswick Club. Why not? Well, I wasn't. Or somewhere else. Maybe a bit too direct.
I think it's interesting though this idea of the extreme centre in relation to the Arts Council, because I think kind of by default the Arts Council do represent the extreme centre because they have to mediate between so many different positions and contexts. No? And I think, in relation to something like that, something like the Brunswick Club is, what I guess I would consider an institution of the left, but it also has to, I guess, entertain and engage with these other forces in order to survive. So what you're saying is actually, can it say no? Can it do it by other means? Can it do it by selling drinks at a bar?
Mm-hmm. Well, that I think, but also for some of the institutions to think, okay, well maybe we'd start thinking of the programming differently. Right, so that we don't chase always the same artists, the same budgets, because that's the circuit of discourse, quality, and so on that we have to uphold.
Yeah, but I think the danger there is that we all know that institutions of scale are also very, very good at celebrating, diversity, different models within their walls, in ways that, allow them in for a kind of weekend takeover or for a one-off event, which don't actually have any meaningful engagement with the institution or actually shift the way in which it operates. So I think you have to be careful that doesn't persist also.
No,
but I think
if one does the experiment, then there will be conflict with the people you allow into the building, and that will bring change. It might not be for the better of the institution. That's possible, entirely possible. It might not be better for the community, but it might be.
Yeah,
we don't know, and if we don't create the situation where it's actually possible to talk back to institutions.
Yeah. And I think thinking about this idea of conflict and the thing that you were talking about earlier, Al, which is this idea of the collective, of collectives in many ways. I guess, in lots of different ways, I imagine that conflict is kind of integral to the way that the Brunswick Club has come about. Absolutely. Because it was obviously originally different groups, different artists. And you talked very much and very clearly about making sure that artists remain central to the things that you're interested in, the questions that you're asking throughout the process. So maybe it's kind of interesting for you to reflect on this idea of conflict as a productive force also in terms of the Brunswick Club.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense what you're saying to me. I think the Brunswick is always kind of trod this line of trying to resist the institutionalness of things. So, whether it be being controlled by an institution or, working with one or within one or ourselves becoming institutionalized. However, we're not, I think I said this earlier, that we're not, naive or arrogant enough to think that we could do it completely on our own, because we wouldn't want to do that anyway, because it's about being a community and creating a better, cultural setting for all of us. But at the same time, it's kind of, so how do we tread that line of being alongside and kind of partners in a way, but to be able to be respected at that level from the institutions, I think, is a difficult task. But I think we'd always say that there's room for both, and we've had a lot of support in the city, and that's been really integral to our development to this point. But within stopping ourselves becoming institutionalized is also really difficult, especially when you get things like funding, because you have to kind of, and like Al said, we seek funding, and that's a good thing, and we're very grateful for everything we have, but it does bring this conflict into a group of people who are trying to work collectively, completely democratically. How do we divide that? Who gets paid what? And, there is a lot of conflict there. And kind of thinking about the precarity thing, which we were speaking about earlier as well, and that being a type of conflict, and that being almost a necessary part of conflict when we were thinking about it's okay for things to be temporary. Because on one hand it is, but obviously we would all love for everything to not be temporary and for things to be sustainable and secure enough for our futures, but potentially no change would ever happen in that sense. And maybe there would be less motivation, less drive, less raw feeling, less anger, less, and that stuff actually does drive artistic practice and moves things forward. So it's kind of, there is, and I do think there is a spot in between all of this that you can exist, but it's about being honest and transparent and seeking support and having a kind of genuine friendly conflict, welcoming that.
I mean, we were saying earlier, and I don't know if Lizzie agrees, but my happiest time at the Brunswick Club was when we were like really up against being evicted the next month, because it really, you talk about the politics of a community, but I think that's an interesting thing to be involved in, and that's an interesting kind of way of being in itself. But when we were really struggling with the with immediate evictions, it brings everyone together with a common purpose. And the question of whether we would come to somewhere like the Arnolfini and take it over if they want us to do that. Something about where we were and the conditions that we were in was important, not so much to us, but to the audiences who came there, and to the, when we talk about the community, it's not just the artists who were involved in paying rent, but the wider community of people who came there. They liked coming to somewhere where the wallpaper's coming off and all of this, and I suppose that's an interesting question for me. I used to work here.
Me too.
And I struggled, I could organise the same event here, which would be an artist film screening or something, and 10 people would come. And we could organise it there, and 200 people would come. And that's a really interesting question for me, why do people, and I think it's because they feel, maybe it's just the architecture, it's the kind of, the way that it's imposing, but especially in Bristol, I don't know, it feels like that kind of artist-led or that kind of underground culture, they want to feel like there's a space where they can go and do what they want.
I think it's about the feeling as well. If you walk into the Brunswick, you don't have to be a certain thing, or, it's kind of, there aren't really rules. I guess there are a couple of rules, but, lock the door and stuff. But, it's kind of that freeing. It's kind of, it's anarchy, isn't it? It's like, it's radicalisation. It's kind of just be and do it, and it's doing it, and that's kind of why we are doing it. Is because, and why we are in collectives is because how do we make things happen? We join together, and we just have to do it ourselves.
But it's also anarchy within certain constraints.
Yeah.
And personally, and I guess this is part of working in non-profit institutions with relatively limited resources, I'm really interested in this idea of the terms and conditions of art making, and constraint is a key part of that. So even though you're talking about kind of anarchy, conflict, it's also within a certain set of conditions. And I guess the struggle now is then to think about, what are the different constraints that you face when you don't have a building with wallpaper falling off the walls, which is a kind of quirky and unique space for people to attend, but you have somehow a legacy and an energy that you carry with you, but not necessarily the circumstances in which to continue delivering that kind of project. So I guess it introduces a bit of an identity crisis.
Yeah, it does, and we definitely want to find, really important to us is having those facilities, because that allows us to do things, and it allows us to generate income and all of these things. That's what we will do. That's our main priority, is to find another place. But in the meantime, we are doing other things, there are other projects developing, we're doing this, a kind of editions label called TBC Editions, which is, we're making editions of DVDs, cassettes, they're being kind of hand printed. A lot of different members of the collective are getting involved, and they're all by members of one of the collectives. And these are sort of different platforms where we can carry on working without having a space to work in. So we are thinking about these things as we go on, but we're not an in a sense we're not an organisation, because we're organised ideally to the bare minimum that allows us to make art and to collaborate.
But we've
so
asked ourselves,
we're improvising,
And we've asked ourselves that question: Are we a building? Are we a, you know? And that's why it's quite interesting what you were saying, Simon, about what was it? Site specific.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, is the Brunswick Club site specific? Does it exist without that building? And that's what we're trying out now. And I think it does, because it kind of transcends walls. It's more of it's an idea, isn't it? It's a concept. It's a community, and it's not just the people who are studio holders that are part of that community, but it's anyone who comes there or has been touched in any way by anything that's happened there.
Yeah, you're doing like Champ School. We did like a beef stage at the Supernormal Festival, which happens in August, and that ended up being a collaboration between Beef and Champ members. So we have all kinds of projects that don't rely on a building, but that does.
But it is important, because it's also about having a like project and test space, a place to develop work. We have got a temporary space at the minute, which is in Pennywell Project Studios, but it's not kind of fit for our purpose. So we're there, we're holding up. We can meet there, and you know, we can still have some activity. But yeah, without like some of the resources that we did have, it's difficult for the project to be, you know, like where it was, for sure. But it can still be something, and it will change, and that's okay.
Yeah, I guess my next question was more of a technical point, which was, to what extent has the formation of the Brunswick Club also like changed or challenged the identity of these different collectives that make it up, actually? So Champ, Beef, because presumably the lines are much blurrier these days than they were at the beginning.
In some ways they're more blurry, in some ways they're more defined, I think. It's an interesting question. I think that being a part of the Brunswick Club has definitely influenced Champ in the way that we work, and the way that we organise. We've learned a lot from a kind of older generation of artists who have done a lot of what we're trying for the first time, or second time or third time. They've done it, you know, more time, and they can teach us that stuff, and that comes from, that's organisationally, but also artistically. I've learned so much artistic practice from the people that I've been able to meet through the Brunswick and through Beef, and I wouldn't have had access to those projects had it not been a collaborative thing. And all of that feeds into the way that you work, and it breeds more collaboration. And we're always, but I think also Champ have kind of realised from being in this situation that we don't have to do everything together, which we kind of thought before. It's like all our projects have to be collective, like, you know, but actually we give a lot more space for our individual practice and come together we support each other a lot, we network, you know, with each other, and it's much more of a kind of a platform that feels steady and allows for people's individual practice and collaboration across collectives. But I'd say it's definitely influenced it, but it's kind of helped us figure out who we are a bit more.
I'd say that the reverse is completely true, and having Champ around and the way that the energy from Champ has really energised Beef in a lot of ways. And it's kind of almost like if you have this kind of clubhouse, I'm not sure it is that, but you know, somewhere where people are meeting, then they meet each other and they talk about their work and they start collaborating. And I think that's happened so much. People just get, you know, people from Champ and Beef have just been collaborating together as well. And we get much bigger audiences through the kind of young kind of artists who are around Champ, you know. So like it was massively important for us, I think, when we came together with you, because we saw so many more people getting interested in the kind of old school practices of Beef, I suppose. Yeah.
I think that's us. So
is it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Wasn't that scary?